The morning sun cast long shadows across the Whitmore ranch as 8-year-old Sarah May sat on the porch steps, her bare feet dangling in the dust. Her cornflower blue dress, once pristine, now bore the stains of a childhood spent running wild across the Texas plains. In her small hands she clutched a wooden doll her father had carved for her last Christmas. Back when he was still alive, back when the world made sense. Ezra Whitmore emerged from the barn, his weathered face etched with the kind of worry that had become his constant companion since his brother's death 6 months ago. At 52, he had never expected to become a father figure to his orphan niece, much less navigate the treacherous waters of frontier politics that seemed to swirl around every decision like dust devils in a drought. "Uncle Ezra," Sarah May called out, her voice carrying that peculiar mixture of innocence and wisdom that children acquire when they've seen too much too soon. "Mr. Caldwell's coming up the road." Ezra's jaw tightened as he spotted the approaching rider. Marcus Caldwell sat his horse like a man born to command, his black suit immaculate despite the dusty ride from town. As the territorial judge and largest landowner in 3 counties, Caldwell wielded power like a weapon, and Ezra had learned to fear his visits. "Sarah May, go inside and help Mrs. Henderson with the washing," Ezra said quietly. "But uncle." "Now, child." Sarah May's eyes flashed with the stubborn streak she'd inherited from her father. "You're going to be polite to him again, aren't you? Even though he's the one who—" "Sarah May." Ezra's voice carried a warning that made the little girl's mouth snap shut. But her eyes remained fixed on Caldwell as he dismounted near the porch, and Ezra could see the wheels turning in her sharp mind. Judge Marcus Caldwell was a man who understood the value of appearances. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his mustache waxed to sharp points, and his smile never quite reached his cold gray eyes. He had built his fortune on the bones of smaller ranchers, using legal technicalities and political connections to acquire land that others had bled to claim. "Ezra, my friend," Caldwell said, extending a gloved hand, "I trust you've had time to consider my generous offer." Ezra shook the offered hand, though it felt like grasping a snake. "Judge Caldwell, I appreciate you riding out, but as I told you last week, the Whitmore Ranch isn't for sale." Caldwell's smile widened, but his eyes remained arctic. "Now, Ezra, let's be reasonable. You're a bachelor trying to raise a young girl on a failing cattle operation. The drought has been hard on everyone, and I hear you've had to sell off most of your herd just to pay the bank." It was true, and they both knew it. The summer had been brutal, with temperatures soaring above 100 degrees for weeks on end. The creek that had sustained the Whitmore Ranch for 2 generations had dwindled to a muddy trickle, and the grass had turned brown and brittle as old bones. "We'll manage," Ezra said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "Will you?" Caldwell pulled a folded document from his jacket. "I've taken the liberty of having the territorial surveyor examine your property lines. It seems there's been a discrepancy in the original land grant. According to these official records, your water rights extend only to the old fence line, not to the creek itself." Ezra felt the blood drain from his face. Without access to the creek, the ranch was worthless, a fact that Caldwell knew perfectly well. "That's impossible. My family has been drawing water from that creek for 20 years. I'm afraid possession isn't always 9/10 of the law, my friend. Not when proper documentation is involved." Caldwell's voice carried the satisfied purr of a cat with a cornered mouse. "Of course, I'm prepared to overlook this unfortunate situation if we can reach an amicable agreement." From the corner of his eye, Ezra saw Sarah May creep back onto the porch, her small face pale but determined. She had heard every word, and he could see the anger building in her young eyes like storm clouds on the horizon. "What kind of agreement?" Ezra asked, though he already knew the answer. "Sell me the ranch for a fair price, say $5,000, and I'll ensure the water rights issue disappears. You and the girl can start fresh somewhere else, perhaps back east where a man can make an honest living without worrying about droughts and cattle thieves." $5,000. It was less than half what the ranch was worth, and they both knew it. But it was also more than Ezra could hope to get from anyone else, especially with the water rights in question. "I need time to think," Ezra said finally. "Of course." Caldwell folded the document and tucked it back into his jacket. But don't take too long. Legal matters have a way of becoming complicated when they're allowed to fester. As Caldwell turned to leave, Sarah May stepped forward, her small chin raised in defiance. Mr. Caldwell? The judge paused, looking down at the child with the kind of patronizing smile adults reserved for particularly amusing pets. Yes, little one? My daddy always said that when a man steals something, he usually tries to make it look legal first. Her voice was clear and steady, carrying across the yard like a bell. He also said that thieves always dress real nice and use fancy words to hide what they're really doing. Caldwell's smile faltered for just a moment, but he recovered quickly. Your father was obviously a man of strong opinions. Yes, sir, he was. Sarah May took another step forward, her wooden doll clutched against her chest like a shield. Uncle Ezra calls what you're doing business, and he's trying to be polite about it because that's how he was raised. But I call it stealing, and I don't care if you are a judge. The silence that followed was deafening. Ezra felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched Caldwell's face cycle through surprise, anger, and finally a cold calculation that made his blood run cold. You know, Ezra, Caldwell said softly, never taking his eyes off Sarah May, raising a child is a tremendous responsibility, especially a child who hasn't learned proper respect for authority. The Territorial Orphanage in Austin has an excellent reputation for correcting such deficiencies. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Ezra stepped protectively in front of his niece, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt .45 on his hip. That won't be necessary, Judge, he said quietly. Sarah May is my responsibility, and I'll handle her education. Caldwell mounted his horse with fluid grace, settling into the saddle like a man accustomed to looking down on others. I certainly hope so, Ezra. For both your sakes. As the judge rode away, Sarah May slipped her small hand into her uncle's calloused palm. You call it manners and he calls it betrayal, she said quietly, her young voice heavy with understanding beyond her years. Ezra squeezed her hand gently, knowing that his 8-year-old niece had just declared war on one of the most powerful men in Texas. And despite the fear that gnawed at his gut like a hungry wolf, he felt a surge of pride at her courage. What do we do now, Uncle Ezra? Sarah May asked. Ezra looked down at the little girl who had just stood up to a territorial judge without flinching, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Now, little one, he said, we fight. 3 days after Judge Caldwell's visit, the first of the accidents began. Ezra discovered the broken fence line at dawn, when he rode out to check on what remained of his cattle herd. 20 head of his best breeding stock had wandered through the gap during the night, scattering across the open range where they would be easy pickings for rustlers or predators. The fence posts had been cleanly cut, too clean for weather damage, too precise for animal interference. Coyotes don't carry wire cutters, Sarah May observed matter-of-factly as she examined the damage alongside her uncle. At 8 years old, she had already developed the frontier child's ability to read sign like a book, a skill that had kept many a family alive in hostile territory. Ezra knelt beside the severed wire, running his fingers along the clean cuts. No, they don't. His voice was grim as he stood, dusting off his knees. Help me round up what cattle we can find. We'll need to repair this before nightfall. They spent the morning chasing down strays, Sarah May proving surprisingly adept at herding despite her small size. Her pony, a paint mare named Buttercup that had belonged to her father, seemed to understand the urgency of their task. By noon, they had recovered 18 of the 20 missing cattle. The other 2 had vanished completely, along with any hope that the fence damage had been accidental. As they worked to repair the fence line, Sarah May kept up a steady stream of chatter that helped mask the worry gnawing at both their minds. She talked about her father's stories, about the books Mrs. Henderson had been teaching her to read, about anything except the obvious truth that someone was trying to drive them off their land. Uncle Ezra, she said as they stretched new wire between the posts, do you think Daddy would have fought Judge Caldwell? Ezra paused in his work, considering his words carefully. His brother James had been a good man but a hot-headed one, quick to anger and quicker to reach for his gun. It was that temper that had gotten him killed in a saloon fight in Abilene, leaving Sarah May orphaned and Ezra struggling to hold together a ranch he'd never wanted to inherit. "Your daddy was brave," he said finally. "Maybe too brave for his own good. But brave and smart aren't always the same thing, little one. Are you saying we should just give up? Let Judge Caldwell steal our home?" The pain in her voice cut through Ezra like a knife. He set down his tools and knelt beside her, taking her small hands in his work-roughened ones. "I'm saying we need to be smarter than your daddy was. Fighting isn't always about guns and fists, Sarah May. Sometimes the best fight is the one your enemy doesn't see coming." That afternoon brought their first visitor since Caldwell's ultimatum. Tom Bradley, who owned the neighboring spread to the east, rode up to the house with his hat in his hands and trouble written across his weathered face. Bradley was a good man, one of the few ranchers in the area who hadn't been bought out or driven off by Caldwell's expanding empire. "Ezra," Bradley said without preamble, "I heard about your fence trouble. Same thing happened to me last week and to the Johnsons the week before that." Sarah May emerged from the house where she'd been helping Mrs. Henderson prepare supper, her ears pricked like a curious cat's. Ezra noticed but didn't send her away. The child had a right to hear what concerned their survival. "How many head did you lose?" Ezra asked. 15, maybe 20. "Found some of them in Caldwell's holding pens when I rode into town yesterday." Bradley's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "When I asked his foreman about it, he said they'd found the cattle wandering on Caldwell land and were just keeping them safe until the owner could be located." "Did you get them back?" Bradley shook his head. "Foreman said I'd need to prove ownership first. Wanted to see bills of sale, breeding records, the whole 9 yards. You know how it is out here, half our cattle don't have proper paperwork." Sarah May stepped forward, her young face serious. "Mr. Bradley, did Judge Caldwell make you an offer to buy your ranch?" The older man looked surprised at being addressed directly by the child, but he nodded. 3 weeks ago. Offered me about half what the place is worth, said it was a fair price considering the drought and all. And when you said no, the accident started happening," Sarah May continued, her voice carrying an adult certainty that made both men uncomfortable. "Now, Sarah May," Ezra began, but she cut him off with a look that reminded him startlingly of her father. "It's not an accident, Uncle Ezra, and we all know it. Judge Caldwell is stealing cattle and cutting fences to make it look like we can't manage our ranches. Then he offers to buy us out for practically nothing, and when we're desperate enough, we take his money and leave." Bradley stared at the little girl with something approaching awe. "Out of the mouths of babes," he murmured. "The child's got it figured better than any of us grown folks. The question is," Sarah May continued, warming to her subject, "what are we going to do about it?" Ezra felt a chill run down his spine. His 8-year-old niece was talking like a general planning a campaign, and the scary part was that she was making more sense than any of the adults involved. "What do you suggest, little strategist?" he asked, half joking. Sarah May's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "We give Judge Caldwell exactly what he wants, Uncle Ezra. We make him think he's won." Bradley frowned. "I don't follow." "Judge Caldwell thinks he's the smartest man in 3 counties, Sarah May explained patiently. "He thinks we're just dumb farmers who don't understand his fancy legal tricks. So we let him keep thinking that while we gather proof of what he's really doing." "And how exactly do we do that?" Ezra asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to hear the answer. Sarah May's grin widened, and for a moment she looked exactly like her father had at her age, full of mischief and absolutely convinced of her own invincibility. "We're going to catch him red-handed, Uncle Ezra. And when we do, we're going to make sure the whole territory knows what kind of man their precious judge really is." As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Ezra realized that his quiet life as a reluctant rancher was about to become very complicated indeed. His 8-year-old niece had just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory, and God help them all, he was starting to think she might actually have a plan to win. The plan Sarah May outlined over supper that evening was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. As Mrs. Henderson served up plates of beans and cornbread, the 8-year-old laid out a strategy that would have impressed a seasoned military commander. "First," she said, using her fork to draw invisible maps on the wooden table, We have to make Judge Caldwell think we're beaten. Uncle Ezra, tomorrow you ride into town and tell everyone who'll listen that you're thinking about taking his offer. Ezra nearly choked on his coffee. Sarah May, if word gets back to Caldwell that I'm ready to sell? That's exactly what we want, she interrupted, her blue eyes blazing with determination. He'll get overconfident, maybe careless. People always make mistakes when they think they've already won. Tom Bradley, who had stayed for supper at Sarah May's insistence, shook his grizzled head. Child, you're talking about playing poker with the devil himself. Caldwell didn't get where he is by being careless. No, Sarah May agreed, but he got there by thinking he's smarter than everyone else. That's his weakness, Mr. Bradley. Pride. Mrs. Henderson, a widow who had worked for the Whitmore family since before Sarah May was born, set down her serving spoon with a sharp clatter. This is madness. That little girl shouldn't be planning anything more dangerous than which dress to wear to church. Mrs. Henderson, Sarah May said gently, with respect, ma'am, I stopped being just a little girl the day they buried my daddy. And if we don't do something, Judge Caldwell is going to take our home and probably send me to that orphanage he mentioned. The stark truth of her words settled over the table like a shroud. In the harsh reality of frontier life, childhood was often a luxury that circumstances couldn't afford. What's the second part of your plan? Ezra asked quietly. Sarah May's expression grew serious. We need proof that he's stealing cattle and sabotaging fences. Real proof that would stand up in a court of law, maybe even a federal court if we can get word to the territorial marshal. And how do we get that proof? Bradley asked. We catch his men in the act. Sarah May turned to her uncle. Uncle Ezra, you know this land better than anyone. Where would you hide stolen cattle if you wanted to keep them out of sight until you could alter the brands or sell them off? Ezra thought for a moment, his mind ranging over the vast expanse of rangeland that surrounded their small ranch. There's an old box canyon about 10 miles north of here, near the border of Caldwell's property. It's got water and grass and only one way in or out. Your daddy and I used to winter cattle there when we were boys. Perfect. Sarah May's smile was predatory. If Judge Caldwell is as smart as he thinks he is, that's exactly where he'd put stolen cattle. Hidden in plain sight on his own land, but close enough to the boundary that he could claim they wandered over if anyone got suspicious. Bradley leaned forward, caught up despite himself in the child's logic. Even if we found stolen cattle there, how would we prove they were stolen? Like I said, most of us don't have proper paperwork for every head. We don't need paperwork, Sarah May said. We need witnesses. Mr. Bradley, how many of your neighbors has Judge Caldwell made offers to? Most of them, I reckon. The Johnsons, the Parkers, old Miguel Santos down by the river. Then we get them all together. We show them where their cattle are being held and we make sure they all see it at the same time. Then, when Judge Caldwell tries to claim the cattle wandered onto his land, we have a dozen witnesses who can testify otherwise. Mrs. Henderson had been listening with growing alarm. Child, you're talking about trespassing on Judge Caldwell's property. That's a hanging offense if he decides to make it one. Only if we get caught, Sarah May replied with the casual confidence of youth. And only if there's no one left to tell the real story. The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Ezra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze coming through the open windows. Sarah May, he said carefully, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we need insurance, Uncle Ezra. We need to make sure that if something happens to us, the truth still comes out. She turned to Bradley. Mr. Bradley, do you know anyone in Austin? Someone who works for the territorial government. Bradley nodded slowly. My brother-in-law works for the territorial attorney general. Why? Because we're going to write down everything we know about Judge Caldwell's operation. Every detail, every suspicion, every piece of evidence we can gather. Then we're going to send copies to your brother-in-law, to the territorial marshal, and to the newspaper in San Antonio. And if Caldwell finds out? Sarah May's smile was cold as winter wind. Then he'll know that killing us won't solve his problem anymore. The truth will come out whether we're alive or dead. Ezra stared at his niece, seeing not the 8-year-old child she was supposed to be, but the woman she was becoming under the pressure of circumstances no child should have to face. There was steel in her spine and fire in her eyes, and he realized with a mixture of pride and terror that she was more like her father than he had ever imagined. There's one problem with your plan, he said finally. What's that? If we're going to spy on Caldwell's operation, we'll need to get close to that canyon without being seen. That means riding through some of the most dangerous country in Texas, probably at night, and doing it without getting ourselves shot by his guards. Sarah May's grin was pure mischief. Uncle Ezra, I've been sneaking around this ranch since I could walk. I know every gully, every stand of trees, every rock formation for 20 miles in any direction. And I'm small enough to go places a grown man couldn't. Absolutely not, Ezra said firmly. I'm not taking a child into that kind of danger. You're not taking me anywhere, Sarah May replied sweetly. I'm taking you. This is my plan, Uncle Ezra, and my home we're fighting for. Besides, she added with devastating logic, who's going to suspect an 8-year-old girl of being a spy? As the adults around the table exchanged worried glances, Sarah May began sketching out the details of their reconnaissance mission with the methodical precision of a seasoned scout. And despite his fears, Ezra found himself believing that his remarkable niece might actually pull off the impossible. After all, she was a Whitmore. And Whitmores never backed down from a fight. 2 weeks later, Sarah May sat on the courthouse steps in Austin, her small hands clutching a leather satchel that contained enough evidence to destroy Judge Marcus Caldwell's empire. The territorial marshal, a stern man named William Hayes, had listened to her story with growing amazement and fury. Miss Whitmore, Marshal Hayes said, kneeling to her eye level, what you and your uncle have done is incredibly brave. And incredibly dangerous. Sarah May nodded solemnly. My daddy always said that doing the right thing usually is dangerous, Marshal Hayes. Behind them, the courthouse doors opened and Judge Caldwell emerged in shackles, flanked by federal deputies. His silver hair was disheveled, his perfect composure finally cracked. When he saw Sarah May on the steps, his face twisted with rage. You little, he began, but Marshal Hayes stepped protectively in front of the child. I'd watch my words if I were you, Caldwell. You're in enough trouble already. The evidence had been overwhelming. Photographs of the stolen cattle in the hidden canyon, testimony from a dozen ranchers, and most damning of all, the detailed record Sarah May had discovered in Caldwell's own office during her midnight reconnaissance mission. The Territorial Attorney General had called it the most comprehensive case of land fraud in Texas history. As Caldwell was loaded into the prison wagon, Sarah May stood and walked to the edge of the steps. Judge Caldwell, she called out, her young voice carrying clearly across the square. He turned, his gray eyes filled with hatred. You called it business, she said simply. I called it stealing. Looks like I was right. Uncle Ezra appeared beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Ready to go home, little one? Sarah May smiled up at him, the weight of the world finally lifting from her small shoulders. Yes, Uncle Ezra. I'm ready. As they walked toward their wagon, Sarah May reflected on the lesson she'd learned. Sometimes the smallest voice could speak the loudest truth, and sometimes calling things by their right names was the most powerful weapon of all. The Whitmore Ranch was safe and justice had prevailed, just as her daddy had always said it would.